The arming sword. This is the blade most people picture when they think of a medieval knight, and for good reason. It dominated European warfare from roughly the 10th through the 14th century. Straight, double-edged, and designed with a simple cross-guard, the arming sword was a one-handed weapon built for both cutting and thrusting. It was light enough to carry all day yet deadly in close combat. Knights wore it at their hip as a sidearm, ready to draw when a battle became personal. What makes it remarkable is how universal it was, carried by nobles, soldiers, and mercenaries alike across nearly every kingdom in Europe. It was not a weapon of the elite alone. It was the standard. And from this foundation, swordsmiths would spend centuries pushing the design further in directions that were sometimes beautiful, sometimes brutal, and always fascinating. The falchion. Despite its somewhat humble reputation, the falchion was one of the most practical and widely used swords of the medieval period. It had a single-edged blade that curved or widened toward the tip, giving it the chopping power of an axe combined with the handling of a sword. It appeared across Europe from the 11th century onward and was particularly popular among infantry soldiers and common fighting men. Unlike the more refined knightly blades, the falchion was built for raw effectiveness. A single well-placed strike could disable an opponent regardless of training. Interestingly, surviving examples show a surprising range of quality. Some are rough field weapons while others are finely crafted with ornate hilts, suggesting even wealthy warriors appreciated its devastating utility. It is a blade that often gets overlooked, yet it proved itself on countless battlefields. The longsword. Few medieval weapons have captured the modern imagination quite like this one. The longsword emerged prominently in the 13th and 14th centuries as armor grew heavier and combat demanded more versatile solutions. Its defining feature was a blade long enough to require two hands, though many fighters used it with one hand when needed. This flexibility made it exceptional. Masters of swordsmanship developed entire combat systems around the longsword, systems documented in historical fighting manuals that survive to this day. Techniques included gripping the blade itself, known as half-swording, to drive the point through gaps in plate armor. It was not simply a cutting weapon. It was a precision instrument. The longsword became the weapon of choice for tournaments, personal duels, and battlefield encounters alike, earning its place as the most iconic sword of the later medieval age. The Zweihander. This sword was built to be overwhelming. Originating in the late 15th and early 16th centuries in the German-speaking regions of Europe, the Zweihander, meaning two-hander, was a massive sword that could exceed 5 feet in total length and weigh up to 7 pounds. It was not a weapon every soldier carried. It was issued to specially trained fighters called Doppelsoldner, mercenaries, who received double pay precisely because they operated at the front of battle formations, using these enormous blades to sweep aside polearms and disrupt enemy lines. Some examples featured a secondary guard called a Parierhaken partway down the blade, creating a de facto short grip for close quarters fighting. The Zweihander represents the outer limit of what a sword could become, less a dueling weapon and more a tool of raw battlefield disruption. The Rapier. By the 16th century, the nature of personal combat was changing. Plate armor was fading from civilian life, and what replaced it on the streets of Renaissance Europe was speed, precision, and style. The rapier answered the need. Slender, long-bladed, and designed almost entirely for thrusting, it was the weapon of gentlemen, merchants, and anyone who needed to defend their honor in a duel. Its swept or cup hilt protected the hand with elegant metalwork that was often as decorative as it was functional. Spanish and Italian masters built sophisticated fencing schools around it, producing treatises on footwork, timing, and geometry that read almost like philosophy. The rapier was never truly a battlefield weapon. It was too fragile for armored combat, but it redefined what swordsmanship meant, shifting the art toward intellect and finesse over brute strength. The estoc. When plate armor became nearly impenetrable to cutting attacks, swordsmiths responded with a blade that abandoned the edge almost entirely. The estoc appeared in the 14th and 15th centuries as a direct answer to the problem of heavily armored opponents. It had a long, rigid, stiff blade with no cutting edge, sometimes triangular or square in cross-section, designed purely to concentrate force into a single driving point. A skilled fighter could probe for the gaps between plates at the armpit, visor, or groin, threading the blade into vulnerabilities that no slashing weapon could reach. The estoc was often used in half-swording technique, with one hand gripping the blade for maximum control at close range. It is a fascinating case of engineering meeting necessity, where the sword essentially evolved away from being a sword in the traditional sense and became something closer to a steel spike. The messer. Not every medieval fighter carried a weapon of noble heritage. The messer was the sword of the working man, a large, single-edged blade with a knife-style handle construction, meaning the tang was sandwiched between two gripped scales rather than enclosed in a traditional pommel and cross guard. It originated in German-speaking regions and was widely used throughout the 14th and 15th centuries. Because it was technically classified as a knife in some legal codes, it could be carried in cities where swords were restricted. This made it popular among tradesmen, travelers, and anyone who needed practical self-defense without drawing the attention of local authorities. Despite its common origins, the messer appears extensively in German fighting manuals alongside longswords and other elite weapons, treated with full seriousness as a combat tool. Its simplicity disguised real lethality. The Schiavona. This sword arrived in Europe through one of the continent's most disciplined and feared fighting forces, the Stradioti, Balkan mercenary cavalry who served under Venetian command during the 15th and 16th centuries. The Schiavona, whose name roughly translates to Slavonian sword, was a cut-and-thrust blade distinguished above all by its extraordinary hilt. A dense basket of interlocking steel bars formed a cage around the hand, offering protection far superior to a simple cross guard. That basket hilt design proved so effective that it was adapted and refined across Europe, eventually influencing the Scottish broadsword, the English mortuary sword, and several other regional designs. The blade itself was practical and straightforward. It was the hand protection that made the Schiavona revolutionary. It represented a pivotal moment when sword design shifted its attention from the blade to the survival of the hand holding it. The Claymore. Few swords carry the cultural weight of the Scottish Claymore. The name itself comes from the Gaelic Claidheim Moor, meaning simply great sword, and the earlier form of the weapon lived up to that name completely. The two-handed claymore of the 15th and early 16th centuries was a large, powerful sword with distinctive downward-angling cross-guard arms that often terminated in four-leaf clover-shaped terminals. It was a weapon built for the brutal close-quarters fighting of the Scottish Highlands, where warriors needed something that could drive through heavy resistance at close range. Later, the term was also applied to the Scottish basket-hilted broadsword, though these were quite different weapons. The original two-handed claymore remains one of the most recognizable national symbols in military history, tied inseparably to a landscape, a people, and centuries of fierce resistance. The sabre. As cavalry warfare evolved through the late medieval and early modern period, one blade form proved uniquely suited to mounted combat, the sabre. With its curved, single-edged blade and slightly forward-weighted design, the sabre was built for slashing strokes delivered from horseback at speed. The geometry of the curve meant a cutting blow naturally drew across the target rather than simply striking it, dramatically increasing the wound it produced. Sabre designs appeared across the Islamic world, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia during the medieval period, with Hungarian and Ottoman variations being among the most refined. The Hungarian hussar sabre, in particular, became enormously influential, spreading across European armies throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. Where the longsword demanded technique, the sabre demanded momentum, and in the hands of fast-moving cavalry, momentum was everything. The scimitar. This blade is perhaps one of the most misunderstood swords in popular history. The word scimitar is a broad Western term applied loosely to a variety of curved Eastern swords, but the weapons it describes, including the Persian Shamshir, the Turkish kilij, and the Arab saif, were each distinct designs with their own combat logic. These blades appeared across the Islamic world from the early medieval period onward, shaped for fast, fluid cuts by horsemen moving at high speed. The kilij, for example, featured a pronounced flare near the tip called a yeoman, which added weight and chopping power to the forward portion of the blade. These were not crude weapons of tribal warriors. They were refined instruments produced by sophisticated metalworking cultures whose techniques rivaled anything in Europe. Their reputation among crusaders and later opponents was one of genuine respect. The Shamshir. Among all the curved swords that emerged from the Islamic world, the Shamshir stands apart for its extreme elegance. Its blade curves so dramatically that it almost forms an arc, making it nearly impossible to thrust effectively but extraordinarily fluid for drawing cuts. It originated in Persia, likely developing into its classic form between the 13th and 15th centuries, and it became deeply embedded in Persian court culture. Ownership of a fine Shamshir was a mark of status, and master bladesmiths producing watered steel, the legendary Damascus-style patterns formed during the forging process, were celebrated as artists. European travelers who encountered Persian cavalry were consistently struck by the speed and smoothness of Shamshir techniques, which bore almost no resemblance to anything in Western swordsmanship. It was a weapon shaped by a completely different philosophy of movement and combat. The Katana. This is a sword that transcended its function and became a cultural symbol unlike almost any other weapon in history. The katana developed in feudal Japan during the Muromachi period, roughly the 14th century, evolving from earlier Japanese blade forms into the curved, single-edged sword recognized worldwide today. Its construction was extraordinary, a composite of different steel types, hard and soft, folded and worked together to produce a blade that was both sharp and resistant to shattering. Japanese swordsmiths developed their craft into a ritualized art form, considering the making of a blade a spiritual act as much as a technical one. Samurai culture elevated the katana beyond a weapon into an expression of identity, discipline, and moral code. Centuries later, it remains perhaps the most studied, collected, and culturally resonant sword ever made, a blade that carries meaning far beyond the battlefield. The medieval sword was never a single object. Across 10 centuries and dozens of cultures, it was an evolving answer to constantly changing questions about armor, about warfare, about status, about identity. Each blade type explored in this video tells a different story, from the universal practicality of the arming sword to the spiritual craftsmanship of the katana. What is remarkable is how much human ingenuity, cultural pride, and hard-won experience lies inside these weapons. They were not merely tools of violence. They were mirrors of the societies that made them. If you found this journey through history worthwhile, consider subscribing so you never miss the next one. There is always more to uncover. Leave a comment below telling us which sword fascinated you most. The answers are often surprising. And if you know someone who would appreciate this kind of deep dive into history, share it with them. More videos exploring the hidden layers of history, culture, science, and human achievement are on the way.